We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us this morning. I've got a few administrative things I'd like to cover before we get started. This webinar will be eligible for CPE, so I'll go over that in just a moment. But wanted to introduce myself. I'm a principal at Sikich and the leader of our manufacturing distribution vertical. For anyone that's not familiar with our firm, we're a global professional services company specialized in accounting, technology, and advisory services. We're also one of the largest CPA firms in the United States. And again, we welcome you to our 2024 supply chain update for manufacturers with RIM Logistics. With everything going on in the supply chain world today, we're thrilled to have Rob and Mark Irwin join us today. I'm not sure if many of you have experienced supply chain issues recently, but I know in the news there's been a lot of discussion about that. So the timing of this presentation, I think, is really, really key. The presentation slides are available in the chat for download in the handouts tab of the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you have any questions for Rob and Mark during the session, please submit them in the questions tab, and we'll try to get those to those before the end of the session. We have some time dedicated for Q&A at the end of the presentation. Today's presentation will be distributed in the coming days, so you can share it with some of your team members. For those of you who wish to receive CPE, please use the conferences IO for the credit tracking for today's session. Rob, can you show that screen so that everyone can see the information about the credit tracking? There'll be 3 codes today that we'll present and give you to enter into conferences IO, and afterwards you will get CP tracking or a certificate from us giving you that hour of CP. Rob, can you advance to the next screen? All right, I'll give you a moment to log in. You can use the web address we've given you or the QR code there on the left-hand side, and I'll give you today's first code is 594. You can enter this by scanning the QR code on the screen with your mobile device or by visiting sikichevents.cnf.io on your web browser. Give you just another minute here just to allow you to get that login taken care of. I know sometimes I've struggled to get that to work quickly, so give you just another 30 seconds to get logged in and enter the first code of 594. All right, that will cover the housekeeping items, and without further delay, I'd like to turn today's presentation over to Rob Mueller and Mark Irwin from RIM Logistics. Gentlemen, you can take over.
All right, thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Team Sikich. We're a proud partner and really enjoy the work you guys do and excited about today's opportunity. So thank you, Sikich. Today, I'm Rob Mueller. I'm the president of RIM Logistics, and we are excited about the opportunity to present our view on what's happening in the market. But before we get to that, I'm going to give you just a quick update and a few slides on RIM Logistics. So as you see here, we really focus on a unique mix of tailored solutions, customer service, and looking at the best technology we can use. As we all know, truck brokers, freight forwarders, everybody has to provide good service at a fair price, at a good price, get space immediately. Those are the basics, the prereqs of getting into the game. But really where we bring our value is in problem solving and making sure that we can be an extension of people's businesses, which is what we focus on doing. As you can see here in the top left corner, Bob Mueller, who is the founder of RIM Logistics, sadly not with us any longer. In 1997, when he was starting RIM with Sheila Seraphin, he said, every customer deserves quality services tailored to their exact needs. The difference between 1997 and 2024 is the technology allows us to do that and scale and grow, which is always a problem in the past. I'm going to pass to Mark Irwin, who is our CFO, Vice President of International, who negotiates all our ocean contracts. and is the #1 problem solver for RIM in this space. Mark?
Good morning, everybody, and good morning, Sikich, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to not only your clients, but I know that we have some customers as well that are joining, and so we welcome you and thank you guys for taking out some important time this morning to talk about what's happening. Obviously, depending on your particular situation, everybody's been impacted a little bit differently. So from a manufacturing base, you may not be feeling, the full impacts of all of the things that are happening globally. But if you're a direct importer, you're probably feeling it and as, being punched in the face every morning. So with that, if we can go to the next slide. And I believe we have a code again.
Yes.
So,
Thank you, Mark. Yes, the second code is 453. Please enter 453 into the event IO. Thank you. You can go ahead and move to the next slide.
I hope all your participants get a free gift with that barcode. All right, so this is a CNBC article. I'm going to kind of run through the slides a little more quickly. There's been a lot of news on what's happening right now, and I think there was some really pointed questions, some pre-questions in the presentation that were very important to kind of start with. So how did we get here? What happened? So a lot of people don't understand, supply and demand is always the core driver of our business, right? It's always been for the last, 3.5 decades that I've been in this business, and supply and demand is always the key component of what drives price and how it impacts everybody in terms of moving international freight, both inbound and outbound. The other piece is obviously currency, the strength of the currency, weakness of your currency, and how that works. So here's how we started. Let's go back to January. We had drought in the middle of Central America. That drought was caused by obviously some people want to say global warming. It could be whatever your belief is. It was a drought. That caused the Gatun Lake, which is the lake that feeds the Panama Canal, to start to drop in terms of its height and its ability to feed the canal. I don't think anybody, we don't point to this on any of our slides, but every time a vessel goes through the Panama Canal, we're talking about 50 million gallons of water that head out into the ocean. That water comes from one source, which is Gatun Lake. I had the pleasant upbringing of my father being a Panamanian local. His father worked on the canal. They were from Minnesota, came down, worked on the canal, and I've been down to the Panama Canal probably 15 to 20 times. I will tell you that it is an environmental wonder. There's a fabulous book called The Path Between the Seas, which is a great book that you all should read if you have a chance to get to it. But the Panama Canal is also very suspect to environmental changes. So Gatun Lake started to bleed out, basically. It wasn't getting refilled. There was also some clear cutting that was happening in Panama that was allowing the groundwater, typically the groundwater when it fell in the jungle, was able to hold into the soil and then eventually kind of seep into the lake. Now with the clear cutting, that water is now evaporating, and it's I think we're headed for some longer term challenges with the Panama Canal itself, and the way it functions. They're working on water conservation pieces, but they're going to take decades to really enact and get going. So the first thing that happened was the draft of the ships got impacted by water levels dropping in the canal. So what happened? Well, we have a lot of heavy cargo, right? We have 20-foot containers. Some of you on this call probably have 20-foot containers of fasteners. So we know that Shamrock's on the call. I know that you're talking about 17, 18, 19, 20 tons, sometimes 25 tons in a container. That obviously pushes the bottom of a ship down, and creates the need for a larger draft on the bottom of the vessel. Those drafts were impacted, and the Panama Canal started asking ships coming through the canal to, lower their draft. So what happens? That pushes vessels that can't meet the draft restrictions to go around South America. And that started to spread out some of the supply chain moving to both the Gulf and to the East Coast. And all of a sudden, carriers found themselves having to put in additional vessels in order to support the drop in the water of Gatun Lake. So that was the beginning. That was the first shoe to drop. In the environment, actually, and the steamship line, kind of everybody rallied, and we didn't really see a huge impact. We saw some price increases, but we mostly saw supply chain delays, and we saw supply chains being impacted by 10, 20, 30 additional days, depending on the weather and what was happening. They, obviously have opposite seasons than what we do, so they're in the middle of their winter, which is also pretty treacherous around that cape. So these vessels are now experiencing some pretty intense, not only weather but also conditions coming around and getting back to the East Coast. So with that being said, the next problem, obviously, everybody was aware that the issue in Israel and Gaza came up, and then the fallout has been tremendous in terms of what's happened in terms of global shipping. For some of you that may not be completely familiar, the opening of the Suez Canal is about 25 miles wide. It allowed Yemen to the Yemen Houthi rebels to deploy missiles that they were supplied with by various bad actors throughout the Middle East and possibly Russia, we're not sure, to start disrupting transit on the Suez Canal. With the Panama Canal being disrupted and now the Suez Canal being disrupted, vessels were actually attacked and hit in our industry. So we had direct damage to ships, and ultimately many of the ships who thought that they had a negotiated settlement with the Yemenis rebels and thought they could get through the canal had another thing coming, and they had to pull out and start going around the African Horn. So all of a sudden now we have two critical supply chains being spread out, and both canals being impacted. The Suez actually has probably had the larger impact, just because the Panama Canal really never shut down. It just slowed transit, and now we have the Suez Canal being essentially almost 100% shut down. There are a few vessels that are kind of sneaking through, but it's not a lot. So what happens there? We have to add somewhere between 12 and 16 new vessels on each vessel string that's serving the East Coast. So all of a sudden, we've now added new vessels, we've added new transit time. So all of a sudden, anybody in manufacturing supply chain is now facing extended transit times from the Far East and from India into the United States East Coast and Gulf. And also parts of those, if you're coming from India serving the West Coast, sometimes you actually go on a reverse transit through the Panama Canal as well. So you're double impacted. You can be double impacted by that transit. So that's kind of where we got to. All of a sudden, again, the market, it kind of rebounded and found its stride, and we saw some pricing going up, but certainly not at the level that we're at today. Rob, can we get to the next slide? So month over month change. This is probably one of the more dramatic, things that we've seen in the market today. The carriers obviously, now are faced with having to charter additional vessels or having to buy additional vessels or bring into service vessels that have been mothballed or that were idle. And after some, including behavior that is typical when we start setting prices in our contract year from the Far East, which is in typically May 1st is the beginning of the new contract season. So in April, the carriers typically will ground some vessels or will idle vessels. They call them notoriously blank sailings. And that allows everybody to feel what we would call sometimes a fake, supply and demand change, and kind of puts a little bit of additional pressure on the negotiations. But if you can see through that, those negotiations don't particularly have any real impact on price. But what we can see is that we're talking about 41% increase in the price of ocean freight, in a single month change. We've experienced the same thing now with May to June. June is obviously not completed yet, but we're seeing very similar price increases. So we're talking about prices that we're starting. Let's just talk about the U.S. West Coast. China to the U.S. West Coast. If you were negotiating a large beneficial cargo owner contract or a large NVO contract, you were probably settling somewhere around $1,800 to $2,000 a container. That same container today is now costing approximately $7,100 to $7,200 to move the same freight on the same route to the same place. In addition, we're starting to see some equipment challenges due to the fact that these vessel strings have all been kind of spread out. So imagine, you have every other hotel in the city's been hit by a tornado, and now you've got to put all the people into one, and then that's really what's happening. And so we're seeing rolls in the Far East, so vessel rolls. We're seeing cargo being delayed. We had 2 weeks ago, we had about 67,000 containers backed up in Singapore, which is a major automation hub for not only the Far East, but for the Middle East. And you have to remember, there's a lot of trade that happens between India and Bangladesh and the Far East for components. And then you have the opposite trade coming through. And a lot of that trade, including Indonesia, transits through Singapore. So Singapore was also gummed up, which is also helping kind of drive prices as well. So if we look at the three major factors, number one is the Panama Canal, number two is the Suez Canal, number three is kind of the latent effect or the domino effect of those two pieces, which is now jamming up Singapore. And then number four is the rolls and the roll pools that are being created in the Far East, which are really quite significant. What's happening? How are we trying to fix it? And what's going on? So next slide, Rob. So one of the things that's happening is obviously global air freight is starting to pick up because people, can't handle the 60, sometimes 65, 70-day transit times that are happening to the East Coast. They're just not sustainable for, different supply chains and different, order management people that have, kind of miscalculated, or not even miscalculated, kind of got caught in the storm. And, this is something that whipped up on the lake right away. And a lot of people are out in boats floating around, not knowing where the shore is. So what's happening is that we're starting to now see a push toward the air freight side. So critical parts, components, manufacturing pieces that have to be here in a certain amount of time, or you're going to be in shutdown, or you're going to be closing down different factories of customers, or even yourselves, are having to try to drive to air freight. So please be aware that the air freight side of the equation is now starting to really impact. And we believe that this is the last domino in the string to really kind of fall, and it could fall pretty significantly. So with that being said, air cargo supply and demand, if you are planning or thinking about involving yourself in global air freight trade, please make sure that you understand that A, there are going to be delays. B, really try to focus on direct services. The the deferred services going through, particularly Far East going through Narita, and other hubs are experiencing 15 to 20-day delays. So this is a market condition. It's not necessarily your forwarder's, condition. But we are, we're recommending as a company that people pay a little bit more for the direct services and move cargo that way. Rob, next slide.
Hey, Mark, is it
Yes.
worth mentioning just what the real impact e-commerce is having on the air freight industry? I mean, that's eating
Yeah,
up
I
so
think
much.
the other piece, and Rob brings up a good point, is that e-commerce has kind of taken over Temu. I think if anybody was watching the Super Bowl, there was some pretty wacky ads that came up. But Temu, who is an e-commerce player, Alibaba, all of these guys are now getting involved with. There are rules in the United States that allow products to come in that are less than $800 to come in without duty, and China's figured it out, and they are bringing in packaging that just drops directly in U.S. mail and is getting delivered by our U.S. Postal Service. That piece is really causing and has been causing probably for 6 months to 8 months some pretty solid supply issues on the air freight side. So e-commerce has definitely changed that. There are some rule changes coming up. We think that the U.S. government is going to probably be driving some of those changes pretty quickly. All right, next slide, Rob. Okay, so before we get to this wonderful new subject, and this is an entirely new issue. I do want to talk about some of the questions around NAC space. The carriers, obviously smell blood in the water. They're trying to operate with extended transit times. They have additional costs. Each vessel that they add and operate on a string adds cost to their situation and what they're doing. So prices are moving up. A lot of people that did negotiate good, fixed rates prior to all of this confluence of events happening are having a difficult time getting their contracts executed. Our understanding is that the carriers intend to come back to those rates and to support the rates that you negotiated or you negotiated with your forwarders within probably a month or two. We're already starting to see some of our fixed rate space come back. It's not as fast as we want it to. It's very frustrating for us and for several of our customers because it's certain lanes are being impacted, particularly on the East Coast. But it is something that we're having a difficult time controlling it. We are fighting the carriers. We're talking about some direct action, both legal and through some different bodies in the government that can kind of try to help us. But that's kind of a last resort, and we're hoping that the market will flush itself out and we can get back to a normalized business in pricing. So what's the next shoe to drop? And what do we need to do to protect the supply chain? That's another great question that was brought up. It was put to us as something that we wanted to talk about in the Q&A. So hopefully I'll tackle some of that now. This is a fabulous poster from 1958 from the labor negotiations, the International Labor Union or the association on the East Coast. This contract is coming due on September 30th. There is a wonderful gentleman who is running that group, the International Longshoremen Association, who is, and as you can see, this brochure talks about not wanting automation at the pier in 1958. So I wonder what that looked like. That was probably adding a crane to the pier. Rob, can we go to the next slide? So here we go. This was in the Journal of Commerce. I believe this was in October of last year. Harold Daggett is the head of the union. They are digging in, and They are looking for somewhere between a 40 and 60% pay increase for their members. They are really sending some strong messaging. We thought that it was going to be a lot tamer because of the fact of the around the elections, and that they might be a little bit more politically savvy in terms of understanding, how they could impact and actually affect the outcome of the election if they decide to strike. And I don't think they care. That's my personal opinion, and everybody's entitled to it. But they also, they see their brothers on the West Coast getting those kind of increases, and they want to participate, and we can't blame them for that. So this happens every 5-6 years. Unfortunately, it's happening with the combination of the Panama Canal, Suez Canal, the stretch out of the vessels, the air freight situation, and now we have this coming to play. So if you are shipping to the East Coast or the Gulf, and utilizing those ports, be aware that that's very possible that in September 30th, and even possibly before and definitely after, there could be a slowdown. There could be an attempted strike. Government has controls when national security is involved, called Taft-Hartley, where they can bring these guys back to work. But I will tell you from experience that bringing them back to work in a hostile environment where they're not being negotiated with properly is not going to be good. They will talk about bad order chassis. They'll talk about broken cranes. They'll talk about reasons that they can't function and can't work at either 180 or even sometimes 60% during a back to work or a forced back to work negotiation. So I don't think it's going to be pleasant. I do believe that there's going to be, unless there's a capitulation on the ownership of which are the steamship lines and the terminal operators. And I just don't see it happening. I was at a conference on Monday with the actual people from the Journal of Commerce, and they also believe that this will probably escalate into something that's pretty crazy. So be prepared. We're seeing a lot of forward push with some of our smarter, kind of in touch guys that are out there moving freight to the East Coast. They're really pouring it on right now, trying to get inventory in to be able to sustain any kind of slowdown or any kind of change. We're also seeing a shift to the West Coast. RIMS put together a transload product out of LA that services the East Coast. So if you have lighter products and you're moving freight, the 4 to 5 or the 8 containers to 10 trucks, transload in Los Angeles is also working, and based on the current freight rates to the East Coast from China, which you're talking about 8,000 and possibly as high as 8,800. That's happening. So it's a competitive product. So we're seeing different ways of dealing with this and with what's happening, but there's no way for us to avoid this particular piece. And this will affect all ports from New York all the way through to Houston. So, be prepared. We want to really, put your radars up on this. You may not be directly impacted as a business, but people that supply you or that bring product in for you may be impacted by this, and they also need to be educated and understand what's happening. So, Rob, I think we have one more slide.
Yeah, Mark, and I also want to point out, when we see these strikes or potential strikes, it's maybe the Canadian ports or even the West Coast ports may say, even the Mexican ports may not be the ones negotiating, but they absolutely stand with their brothers and slow down and impact trade. Just because it's not the East Coast, we'll see problems in all of these locations, I'm sure, right?
Yeah, I think that it'll be much more tempered, particularly with the new agreement that they have on the West Coast. I think it's important for everybody to understand that, to Rob's point, these guys are all connected. It's an industry that is still based a lot on nepotism and kind of older ways of working. And, there's a drive to kill automation and to kill some of the things that are happening. So ultimately, that if the port's nationalized or if there's something that happens that radically, then, that's going to be a large disruptor. But hopefully they can get through it. This is always a slugfest. It's something that it's going to be very relevant. It's going to be extremely relevant in the news coming up. We're not really hearing about it or talking about it yet, but we think that forward-thinking people are going to understand the impact that this is going to have on not only their supply chains but their partner supply chains and people that are also involved with their with the various businesses. And also we see the same on the air freight side. So I'd like to leave a couple of minutes for questions. Obviously, there's a lot happening out there. I tried to get to the many pre questions that were sent in, and certainly look forward to trying to help you guys. And even after offline, Sikich can give you our contact information. We're happy to try to help or give some advice or speak to people. There's a lot of denial that's in this market that people don't understand all of the complicated components that are happening to the marketplace, and it's important that we educate and we talk to people as much as we can about what's going on, what we're trying to do to solve it, and how do we move forward, and what are the better ways to kind of avoid some of the really large potholes that are in our way.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Rob.
Well, I was just going to ask Mark on the before I turn it over, Jerry. The
Sure.
upcoming election and the potential of whichever side wins, the impact that may have, whether it's an escalated trade war with China or increased tariff, the election itself, is that going to impact third quarter shipping, and how much is that going to impact? Do we think is that just a footnote, or is that another real thing that's going to surge rates leading into the election?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that there's going to be it's obviously going to be a major topic of discussion, but I think that the East Coast labor unions have already kind of performed the magic of saying we don't care, and that was a surprise. At the beginning of the year, we thought that there would be some dancing and some kind of careful consideration of who was going to be impacted negatively, but it looks like from right now that that's not the case. But things change. This is a volatile, extremely volatile market, and we just don't know. So, somebody asked me, where are rates going to be in 3 months, and I think honestly, if we can keep status quo, I think they come down. I think the market starts to soften a little bit because that supply and demand question isn't out there. We had, to Rob's point, we had an opportunity to charter and to really kind of relieve some of the pressure that was out there. And what we saw was the market was delivering those charters as well as some steamship lines were putting on some extra loaders in order to alleviate not only the Singapore issue, but also the roll pulls. And we're starting to see those, happen today. So our hope is that the rates start to drop. Interestingly enough, there's also one new development, and it's not substantiated yet, and I can talk about it, but I can't verify it. That the MOT in China, which is their version of the FMC in the United States, is looking to cap rates to the carriers, which is unheard of. We haven't seen that happen before. So there's some discussion around rate capping, which may happen if the carriers continue to try to push rates up. China also doesn't want to lose its competitiveness in the world. And, if the carriers drive business out of China because of, the cost to move goods is too expensive, then, that's a big deal. So we'll see if MOT steps in and it's really official, but we're hearing some rumblings on that, and I think that's really actually a big development. And for anybody that's really active in our space, having a market cap is going to be wonderful. So if that happens. We're hopeful that it will. And here's your
Yes.
last prize.
Yeah, we have our last code for today's CPE. It's 717. Please enter that into Conferences.io if you need the CPE credit. I appreciate the presentation. Is great information, great background on what's happening, why we're experiencing some of the delays and cost increases. And we've got a nice chunk of time left here for the audience to submit a question. So if you haven't already submitted a question, we encourage you to submit one to our experts using the question feature in the GoToWebinar. I've received a few already, so we'll go ahead and start with some of these questions we've received in advance or during the presentation. Mark, you kind of touched on one item around China. One of the questions submitted was, is there any update on the port congestion in China, and can we expect to see improvements soon?
Yeah, I think yes, and yes on all fronts actually. The extra loaders are now creating the opportunity for the carriers to kill the roll pools, which has been the biggest problem that we've had. You book freight today, and your container gets stuck at the port and doesn't move. We've had in some cases we've had multiple rolls, which is horrifying. Typically it's about a week, but we've seen roll pools get to 2 weeks. During the pandemic, roll pools got to 6 weeks. So this is not pandemic level pressure. We don't have the same type of backlog that we had during the pandemic. So the pressure is different. So the supply side guys are definitely right, but this strung out new vessels, spread out equipment. The real issue right now in China is not necessarily port congestion. It's the availability of 40-foot high cube containers. There's because of the way that the high cube is designed, it's able to be utilized usually at maximum height, and you're getting quite a bit of freight into those containers. Right now, we have a lot of 40-foot standard containers available, but the high cubes are hard to find. So I think the next thing that you see is going to be a drive or an equipment change. So on the supply chain side, again, you might want to prepare product or product design to be able to be moved in 40-foot standard containers, or have a plan for that if your suppliers come back to you and say, look, we cannot get high cubes. How do you want to load, and what kind of configuration do you want to use? And that may just be standing freight on its side. It may be killing pallets in the container. It may be to get maximum cube inside what you're doing. So just be aware that that's really kind of the new. We think that's going to be the new challenge in the next couple of months.
Thank you for that. Another question presented to us is, as a president of a mid-sized manufacturing company, what should I be doing to better manage these supply chain risks, especially with so many international disruptions happening today?
It's this is plan ahead, right? This is Rob and I are both chess players, and I've been a chess player since I was 5 or 6, and I think that this market it's about the chessboard, right? It's about understanding where the pieces are, how they're going to move, and then really some of the things that we talked about today. I think avoiding the East Coast, later on this year is really a wise move if you can. Finding alternatives to, finding an alternative to China is not necessarily a solution right now, because these ports are all gummed up. We do have some effective solutions to get freight into the Midwest. We actually now, with Lázaro Cárdenas open in Mexico, the CP Rail has bought Kansas City Rail, and now they have what's called the CPKC, which has a direct service and is starting to migrate service from Lázaro into Chicago. That's about a 7-8 day transit. It's not really been fully tested, but if we have a strike, the Mexican ports will become an option. So those are some of the things that we're doing. and looking at in terms of trying to pre-plan. But I think the idea is get with your forward provider and really have a sit down and, lay out a strategy of what you need and how you need it and when you need it. So it's about really sitting down and taking the time to really understand all of the things that affect you individually, because certain ports. The other big piece in China that's happening is that inland ports, for example, Wuhan, Chongqing, Beijing, are all struggling because carriers want these boxes to move in and out of China as quickly as possible. They want a turn and burn on their freight and particularly on the containers. So you're really seeing a push for port-to-port cargo. You're really seeing that the carriers understand that they're losing revenue by running freight into Chicago, St. Louis, Omaha, Detroit. That pushes their ability to rotate a box. It can change as much by 40 days, which if you look at it overall, that's taking the container out of action for half of the year. So those are things that are happening today. So if your supply chains are inside China at interior points that are either on the Yangtze River or that are at major rail hubs, you really want to look at the possibility of trucking to the port, and then either loading freight at the pier at the port, or trying to pull a container from the port operations and load in those cities and then truck back. So those are some of the things that you can do, but obviously you need to sit down with your logistics professionals and develop a plan.
I also think, Mark, on those small to medium-sized companies, just having the flexibility to think outside the box, consider alternative container equipment, whether that's NORs or 20-footers, or if you need a certain commodity, a certain product, and you don't want to have that inventory carrying costs, you can always do LCL for specific products and get that consistency of flow. The bigger companies that are bringing in hundreds of containers, that this isn't really those aren't that viable for them, but for those small to medium, that can have a big impact.
Yeah, and non-operating reefers, or as Rob said, NORs, are also good solutions for heavy cargo. You can actually get a better discount on a 40-footer than you can on moving a 20. So those things are out there. The steamship lines are a little more motivated to move non-operating reefers because they need them back in the United States to move their frozen meat and beef back to China. All right, any other questions, Jerry?
Yeah, we've got I've got time, I think, for one more question. If you can give us your thoughts on how emerging technologies like AI, Internet of Things, blockchain, are any of those technologies going to revolutionize supply chain in any way? Have you seen any of that kind of activity began?
Yeah, I'll take it this real quick, and then Rob, if you want to jump in behind me. No, look, here's the funny part about what we do. We still move product from point A to B. We've got to move a box on a ship, from one point to another. We've got to move a box on an airplane from one point to another. So does it affect supply chain? Yeah, yes, it does. I mean, obviously around documentation, around the ability for us to, clear customs. Some of those things, those technologies are definitely going to be impacted, and they'll become more efficient. And that's been happening for the last 30 years, right? We went from, telex to AI, and now we're already employing a lot of AI technologies for reading documentation that's coming in. So RIM is absolutely, doing that. But does it affect transit? I don't know. I don't think so. But I do know that it, in fact, so it impacts our ability to be more efficient, to operate at a lower cost. And I think, it's going to have a wild effect on our business. But I don't think it impacts transit. How's that?
Thank you for
I would
that.
say the answer to that, what I would add to what Mark said, is that AI and BI and blockchain, all these tools are real, and they are relevant. That said, we're not. I would say our industry, and certainly RIM Logistics, is skeptical of being early adapters and over pursuing something at the expense of our customers or otherwise, and being too creative too quickly. There's still a lot of uncertainty in those areas, certainly around AI. Where I will tell you that AI is having a big impact for RIM Logistics is exactly what Mark said on the efficiency, on the labor costs of repetitive, data crunching. Okay, so if something is being done over and over and over again, and it is just simply filling in boxes, that's where we are being creative with AI, and RIM is continuing to implement that in our business. But we're not allowing AI or other technologies of that nature to, we're not pursuing it too quickly because we don't want to be caught. We're sticking with the traditional way of doing it, and we're following other people, and we will be quick to adapt versus leading ourselves possibly off a cliff, right? So we're just
Sure.
going to follow technology and adapt.
That makes
Just
sense.
one last piece too. I just want to thank everybody for their patience. This is hard time, right? So, I don't, whether you're using RIM or you're using somebody else, I think it's, calm heads, are going to find solutions. It's not a time to be, in everybody's face. It's a time to try to understand what's happening and try to be patient and try to, get to the core and the root cause of things. So we just, all we ask is be a little patient with our business and our industry. What's happening today is unprecedented again. And, here we go. So please let us try to help, and let your providers try to help. But it's a tough market, and we look forward to, like I said, for our customers, really trying to provide, innovative and technologically sound solutions that, get freight from A to B.
Thank you for that. We're at the top of the hour, and I want to be mindful of everyone's time. If you didn't get your question answered, we're going to go through those and make sure you get answers to those questions. We'll send that out and make sure that you take the brief survey that will pop up at the conclusion of the webinar so that you can get your CPE and hit the check out button in Conferences.io so that it submits your request for that CPE. We'll get those certificates out in the next couple of weeks. The recording will be available in the next few days. And thank you again, Mark and Rob, for your insights. This is very helpful to better understand what we can expect over the next several months. Thank you again for joining us, everyone, and have a great day.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sikich.
Take care,
Take care,
everyone.
everyone.